The Alliance Act, I the dot? The dot wasn't moving. I'd pulled up his location the way you pull up anything after 17 years. Muscle memory, not suspicion. Thai or pizza, that was all I wanted to know. One thumb, two taps. His blue circle sat above a street I recognized. 4412 Birchwood Drive. The Kroger parking lot hummed around me. A cart scraped across asphalt somewhere to my left. 2 rows over a minivan reversed with that high, flat beep, beep, beep that didn't stop. My engine was still running. The dashboard said 847. I looked at the dot. I had driven past that address once. 2 years ago on a Wednesday night after I found a receipt in his coat pocket for a restaurant I'd never heard of in a neighborhood we didn't go to. I told myself I was being crazy. I drove past the house slowly like a woman who had taken a wrong turn, and I went home and I made dinner. And when he came in at 9:15 and said, "Client dinner ran long," I said, "How was it?" And he said, "Good." And I said, "Good." The dot didn't move. I am 51 years old. I have been the branch manager at Heartland First Bank for 9 years. Every week I sit across from someone who needs me to believe their numbers, and I review their documents, and I decide whether the story they're telling matches the evidence they've provided. I am good at my job. I looked at the dot for 4 minutes. Then I opened our text thread. Scrawled past tonight's messages, his at 6:18, mine at 6:42. The usual logistics of a shared life. I typed without deciding to type. "Don't worry, honey. Work late as long as you need. Joel, it's not what you think, Joel. Just let me explain." I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. I put the car in reverse. I didn't go home. I drove around the block 3 times, which is something I haven't done since I was 24, and couldn't make myself go back into the apartment after the first serious heartbreak I'd ever had. I'm not 24. On the 3rd loop, I didn't cry. On the 4th, I pulled over under a streetlight and picked the phone up again. Joel had called 6 times. There was a notification from a number I didn't have saved. A text. I didn't open it. I put the car in drive and I went home, and I drove the whole way thinking about a dot on a screen and how long it had been sitting above that address before I happened to look. The kitchen light was on when I got in. I hadn't left it on. I stood in the hallway for a moment, keys in my hand. Then I walked to the kitchen, set my purse on the counter, and filled a glass of water I didn't drink. The cat came in from wherever he'd been and sat by his bowl and looked at me. "I know," I said. I fed him twice before I realized I'd already done it. The text from the unknown number had been sitting in my pocket the whole drive home. I opened it, standing at the kitchen counter with the overhead light, too bright for what kind of night it was. Unknown. This is Frank Calloway, Renee's husband. I saw the message she got from you. I think we should talk, but not tonight. Tomorrow, if you're willing. No anger, just information. I read it 3 times. He knew. He'd seen it, and his first move wasn't to call his wife, wasn't to call Joel. He'd called me, and the phrase he chose was no anger, just information, which is the kind of thing a person says when they've had time to get past the anger part. Frank, I know you don't know me. I understand if you don't respond. Frank, I've been watching a pattern for 4 months. I thought I might be wrong. Frank, your message confirmed I'm not. 4 months. He'd been watching for 4 months. While I was in this kitchen, in this house, feeding this cat, approving loan applications for 4 months, a man I'd never met was keeping a record of my husband. Joel came home at 10:40. I was at the kitchen table with my hands around a mug that had gone cold. He said Tess and I heard in those 3 letters everything he'd prepared to say, the whole careful explanation he'd been assembling in the car on the way home, and I said, "I'm tired. Let's talk tomorrow." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he went down the hall. The floorboard outside the bedroom second from the door has creaked for 6 years. We keep saying, "We'll fix it," gave its usual complaint. The bedroom door closed. The house went quiet. I texted Frank Calloway back. 10 a.m. Stoffs on North 4th? Then I sat there until well past midnight in the light of a kitchen I'd shared for 14 years, and I thought about how 4 months ago I was planting a vegetable garden because I thought I was depressed and needed a project. In the morning, he made coffee. That was the thing that hit me walking out at 6:30. He made coffee. 2 cups the way he always did, the French press he got me for our 10th anniversary, sitting on the counter like every other Tuesday. He was at the kitchen table with the newspaper he wasn't reading, and when I came in, he looked up with a careful version of his regular face and said, "Morning." "Morning," I said. I poured my coffee. He wrapped both hands around his mug. The news came out of the small speaker on the counter, the same local anchor, the same traffic report. I stood at the kitchen window and drank and looked at the backyard, at the garden bed I'd put in over the summer. The tomato cages still standing from October. The whole project slightly crooked because I'd done it myself one weekend when he was away at a conference. He asked if I wanted eggs. I said I had an early meeting. "Okay, love," he said. I got my coat. I got my bag. I walked out the front door, and I sat in the Subaru for a moment before I started the engine, and I thought he said, "Okay, love," this morning. And 2 years ago, he looked at me with patient disappointment when I asked him about a restaurant receipt, and I apologized. And both of those things are true at the same time, and I am going to have to carry them both for the rest of my life. I started the car. I drove to Stuff's. Frank Calloway was already there. I'd gotten there 5 minutes early, and he was already at a corner booth with his back to the wall and a black coffee in front of him. And the first thing I noticed was that he had a manila folder, not thick, rubber band around it. He looked like a man who had prepared for this conversation the way you'd prepare to present findings to a client. He was tall glasses, somewhere in his early 50s, with the kind of face that spent a lot of time listening. "My name is Tess Gallagher, and I am 51 years old, and I ordered black coffee and sat down across from a stranger who had 4 months of evidence about my husband in a rubber-banded folder." And the morning light came through. The front window at an angle that made everything in that coffee shop look very clear. "I want to be clear about something before we start," he said. "I'm not here because I'm angry. Okay. I'm here because I spent 4 months building a picture, and I think you have pieces I don't." I wrapped my hands around my mug. "How long have you actually known since October?" He picked up his coffee. "Suspected since July. And you didn't confront her." "I needed data first. I'm an engineer. If you patch a crack without knowing what caused it, the crack comes back in a different wall." He opened the folder. 8 photographs. Not professional surveillance. Phone screen photographs, the kind you take when you're standing in your own kitchen, holding your own phone, catching a reflection or a preview or something left open. Joel's car above a driveway. Timestamps in the corner of each frame. Wednesdays mostly. Some Thursdays. 2 months in Wednesdays and Thursdays both. He'd tracked them against the calendar, client dinners on ours. I'd approved those calendar entries myself 11 times over 3 months without once asking which client. The second to last page, a screenshot of a text exchange. Joel's number. 9 months ago. "Joel, I miss this. I miss you. I think about it constantly. Renee." Then stop pretending. 9 months ago, I was planting tomatoes in April because I thought I was depressed and needed a project. Frank slid the last page across the table. A screenshot of a voice note. His phone aimed at Renee's screen, the transcription visible below the audio bar. "Joel, I've been thinking about what you said. I think you're right. It's time." I read it twice. 3 weeks ago, Frank said. "What did she say back?" she said, finally. I set the page down, kept my hands flat on the table. The coffee shop kept going around us, the espresso machine, a kid at the counter asking about oat milk, 2 women near the window laughing at something on a phone. All of it at the same volume, the same ordinary Tuesday morning frequency. 3 weeks ago, I said, I found a receipt in the folder we keep for home expenses. A consultation fee. A law firm I didn't recognize. Frank looked at me steadily. "I looked them up," I said. "They specialize in contested divorce." He nodded. Once. "He has a head start." The espresso machine ran. The 2 women laughed again. The kid at the counter got his oat milk. He was going to be the one to file, I said. And as I said it, I understood the rest of it, the narrative he'd been building, the story where he was the one who finally made a hard decision, where I was the one who had simply not been enough. He'd been writing the last chapter of our marriage for months, and he hadn't told me it was happening. Frank said, "I'm not a lawyer, but I think whoever files first in Ohio shapes the process." I looked at him across the table, at the folder he'd spent 4 months building because he needed data before he could believe something that was true. "I need to make a call," I said. He nodded. He didn't ask who to. I already had the number. Karen Osei, family law, 12 years, 3 referrals from the bank. I'd looked her up at 2 in the morning and I hadn't let myself think about why. I got up from the table. I walked outside onto North 4th Street into the October cold and I called her and she picked up on the second ring. Karen Osei had a voice that cut through things. Not sharp, exactly efficient. She didn't say hello when she picked up. She said, "Tell me what you have." I was standing on North 4th Street with my coat half buttoned and the October wind coming in off High Street, and I told her. The location, the texts, the consultation fee for the divorce attorney, Frank Calloway, and his 4 months of photographs. The voice note with its 3 words, "It's time," and the timestamp that put it 3 weeks before I ever looked at that blue dot in the Kroger parking lot. Karen was quiet for a moment. I heard her writing. "Ohio allows fault divorce on adultery grounds," she said. "What you're describing, the texts, the documented pattern, the third-party corroboration, that's inclination and opportunity. That meets preponderance of evidence. What does that mean for the filing? It means if you file first on fault grounds, the equitable distribution calculation tilts in your favor. It also means his strategy, which, based on what you're telling me, was no fault, irreconcilable differences, he controls the narrative, becomes moot the moment our filing hits the clerk's office." Behind me through the window, Frank was still at the corner booth, hands around his coffee, looking at nothing the way a man looks at nothing when he's been sitting with something too long to be surprised by it anymore. "When can you take the case?" I said. "I can see you Thursday," Karen said. "Don't move any money. Don't confront him. Don't tell anyone outside this call what you're planning. He doesn't know about Frank." "Good. Keep it that way." I went back inside and sat down across from Frank and didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't ask. I said Thursday. He nodded once, picked up his coffee, and we sat there in the ordinary noise of a Tuesday morning while the rest of the coffee shop went about its business as though nothing had changed. My coffee had gone cold. I had my hands flat on the table. I was already thinking about what Thursday would look like, what I'd need documented, and in what format, what gaps Frank would need to fill. I went back to work at noon. I approved 2 loan applications and denied 1. I answered 17 emails. At 4:15, I sent Frank a text, "I want to do this right. Are you still willing to be part of that?" His response came back in 4 minutes. "I've been ready since October." That night, I texted him again. One question I needed answered before Thursday. "If this goes to a hearing affidavit, your testimony, do you understand what that means for your own situation, Frank?" "Yes. It means it's over. I already know it's over. I just need the documentation to be clean." I put the phone down and thought about that for a while. 17 years ago, I married a man who would later speak casually about his dead father's prescriptions, and I chose Frank Calloway's answer to sit with instead, because it was the only thing anyone had said in the last 4 days that I recognized as completely true. "Okay," I typed back. "I'm in." Then I went to bed at 10:30 and lay there listening to Joel breathe beside me and did not sleep. Friday night, I got out 14 months of bank statements. Joel was at a symphony board dinner. I had approved that calendar entry 6 days ago without comment, same as the 11 client dinners before it, and the house was mine. I took the statements to the home office, the small room with the window that looks onto the backyard, and spread them across the desk in order. This is what I do. Literally what I do for a living. Small ATM withdrawals. $200, $300, $250, $200. Never the same machine twice in a row. That part was deliberate, the rotation. He'd been careful about that, but the amounts were consistent, and the frequency was consistent, once every 2 or 3 weeks, 14 months running cash that didn't correspond to any household expense I could identify. $31,400. Not a large number by itself. Spread over 14 months, it came to roughly $2,200 a month. Flowers, dinners paid for in cash, so they wouldn't appear on the joint card. A hotel, maybe. The kind of parallel life you can sustain on $2,200 a month if you're methodical about it. If you're the kind of man who never uses the same ATM twice in a row. The printer ran. The cat settled under the desk, his weight against my ankle, and I photographed every page and backed it up to 2 separate cloud accounts. And then I did what I do with a pattern that doesn't match the stated account purpose. I wrote a summary. 3 pages. Same format I use for suspected fraud referrals. Date range, transaction amounts, rotation pattern, cumulative total, correlation with documented external records. I trusted him. I wasn't looking. I trusted him. I should have been looking. The 2 thoughts kept arriving in that order. I let them. No. Trusting someone is not the same as failing to audit them. I stopped at that, left the question on the desk next to the statements, went to make more coffee because I had a lot left to do. The second meeting with Frank was Saturday morning. He'd printed the voicemail screenshot formally, this time not a quick phone photo, but an actual document. Print the contact name, reading Joel G. Clearly visible the timestamp in the upper right corner. He set it on the table between us without preamble. 3 weeks ago, he said. 1 week before you looked at the location. How did you document all of this? The notebook, the photos, personal phone, not the shared plan. A small notebook in my truck. He paused. I told myself I needed 3 months of consistent evidence before I'd let myself believe it. Because I'd rather be wrong. Were you always this careful I build structures? He said. If I'm not careful, things fall on people. The coffee shop was quieter on a Saturday. Fewer laptops, more couples. A man near the front with a physical newspaper, both hands holding it open. She told you it was over, I said. 2 weeks ago. Right after your text. He looked at the table. She said she was stupid and it was nothing, and please don't do this to our marriage. Do you believe her? No. He picked up his coffee. But that's not really the point anymore. He trusted what he built. That was the thing I kept coming back to on the drive home. He measured twice and cut once, and then he waited, kept taking notes and photographing screens and storing everything on his own device. Not because he was preparing for court, but because he needed the data to match the picture before he'd let himself act on it. I had spent 2 years smoothing over the misalignment with Joel's explanations, measuring once and trusting his cut. I was tired all at once in the car on North 4th Street of his explanations. Sunday, Joel made chicken with rosemary. He does that on Sundays, has since year 2, learned it from his mother. There's a particular confidence in the way he moves around the kitchen on Sunday evenings, unhurried, practiced, that I used to find reassuring, like evidence of continuity, like proof the structure was sound. The news was on low. 2 wine glasses on the counter. I sat at the kitchen island with my iPad open to our joint account, which I'd been looking at every day for a week, and I timed the question the way I time questions. In loan review, meetings not hostile, just precise. Joel, I've been going through our accounts. Bank habit, you know how I am. I noticed some cash withdrawals I can't quite account for. He didn't turn around right away. Which ones? The ATM withdrawals. Pretty consistent over the last year or so. Small amounts. He turned then. Patient face. The one I knew well, slightly concerned as though sorry I'd had to bring this up. Oh yeah, I've been getting cash for Dad's prescriptions. He doesn't like the pharmacy delivery, you know how he is about that. I didn't want to mix it in with the household account. His father died in February of 2022. I let the lie sit in the air between us. It didn't crash or shatter anything. It arrived and I held it and I said, of course, that makes sense. and watched him turn back to the stove with the ease of a man who has said this kind of thing so many times it no longer costs him anything to say it. My phone was in my cardigan pocket. It had been recording for 4 minutes. Ohio is a one-party consent state, which means you can record a conversation you're a participant in without telling the other person. I'd confirmed that with Karen on Thursday and had been carrying my phone in that pocket for 3 days waiting for exactly this. He plated the chicken. He poured the wine. We ate dinner, and he asked about my week, and I told him about a small business loan out in Hilliard equipment expansion, solid numbers. I approved it. He said, "Smart call." I smiled at him. I cleared the dishes. On my way back from the sink, I passed behind where he sat at the table and glanced down at his phone the way you glance at something you're not supposed to see. A name. Renee. He put the phone face down the moment I passed, smooth and unhurried the way you put a phone down when you've had years of practice at it. I went to the sink. I turned on the water. 2 days later, he moved $22,000. I was at my desk at 9:12 when the alert came through to my work email, a monitoring flag I'd set on our joint account. The previous week's standard procedure from a dozen suspected fraud cases. Large transfer initiated joint savings, outgoing. $22,000 to an account number I didn't recognize. I counted to 74. I counted because it was something to do. He'd known something shifted at dinner. My lack of reaction, maybe he was practiced at managing my reactions. And when there was nothing to manage, he would have felt the absence of it, the way you feel a door that should have opened and didn't. He was accelerating, deciding the marriage was already finished and beginning to act on that decision without telling me he'd made it. The $22,000 wasn't the money. It was him deciding our shared assets were already his to move unilaterally because he'd already made the other decision and saw no reason to wait. I called Karen from my office with the door closed. He moved $22,000, I said. When 9:07 this morning? Okay. Ohio doesn't have automatic freezes on filing like some states do, but with your documented dissipation, plus this transfer, a judge will grant it. The new account, too. Everything he's moved from the marital estate is subject to review. The court calls it dissipation, spending marital assets in anticipation of divorce. He's just handed us Exhibit A. I sat there with my hand on the desk door closed, the muffled sound of the bank floor just outside. Exhibit A. 14 months of careful small withdrawals. Never the same machine. Twice amounts small enough not to trip an alert. And then he panicked over a Sunday dinner where I said nothing and moved $22,000 in a single transaction. Careful when he thought he was in control. Sloppy the moment he wasn't. That afternoon, Frank called. I was in my car in the bank parking lot about to drive home. His name came up on the phone, and I answered without thinking. "I need to tell you something," he said. The voice was the same steady tenor. He was at the Holiday Inn on Morse Road. He'd checked in 2 days ago. He'd left the house without drama, the way he apparently did everything, not because he was pushed out, but because he needed accurate information and wasn't going to get it at home. Joel had found Frank's number on Renee's phone. Confronted her. She'd called Frank and told him it was completely over. She'd been stupid. Please don't do this to their marriage. "Does it change anything for you?" I said. "I want you to know it doesn't change anything on my end." I said I'd sign the affidavit. "I will." I looked at the parking lot. A woman was loading groceries into a minivan 3 spaces over the same unhurried Tuesday afternoon that the whole world seemed to be operating on while everything else fell apart. "Frank, you don't have to. If your situation..." "My situation is what it is," he said. "I'd rather know exactly what I'm deciding about than make a decision based on incomplete data. That's all. I'm sorry. So am I. 2 people who deserved better than incomplete data." I thought about that the whole drive home. 17 years accepting Joel's version of the numbers, his framing, his reframes, his patient corrections to my own perception. You trust the load-bearing wall because it's always held. Because you've built everything on it, and so you don't check it, and you don't check it, and you stop noticing that you've stopped checking? Frank had checked it. Found the crack, got out a notebook, stayed. Karen's office was on the third floor of a building on East Broad Street, framed Ohio landscapes in the waiting room chairs, nicer than they needed to be. I sat in one of those chairs at 2 on Thursday afternoon with my summary document and the recorded audio and Frank's photograph of the voicemail, and I thought I was walking in to confirm what I already knew. Karen closed the door and set a folder on the desk between us. "There's something I need to tell you before we talk strategy," she said. 3 weeks ago, the same week Joel sent the voice note to Renee, he had consulted a divorce attorney. Karen's colleague at another firm had confirmed a strategy session, one meeting focused on uncontested dissolution with complex asset division. Joel's attorney had prepared a filing strategy, the central argument irreconcilable differences, clean, no fault, nothing inflammatory, 2 reasonable people who had grown apart, and alongside that, a secondary file documented evidence that I had exhibited patterns of emotional unavailability and anxiety affecting the marital relationship. I sat with that for a moment. "He framed my job stress as mental illness," I said. "He framed it as incompatibility," Karen said. "In a no-fault filing, there's no legal requirement for accuracy. He just needs it plausible enough to shape the temporary order's asset division support calculations. If he files first on no fault with that supporting narrative, he steers the process, and you spend the next year reacting. The patience, the calm explanations, the way he'd always been the steady one, the one who helped me understand what I was feeling, who reframed my doubt as anxiety and my perception as instability. For 17 years, I thought that was what a good partner offered, the gift of a clearer picture. He wasn't offering me a clearer picture. He was building a case file. He was planning to leave me on his schedule," I said. Karen said yes, while we were still eating dinner together. While I was approving his calendar entries, people in this office see this with some regularity. The preparation starts before the conversation does. Behind her desk, a window with a view of a parking structure, concrete rows of cars, the practical architecture of a Thursday afternoon. "What's the good news?" I said. She opened the folder. "He hasn't filed yet, and you have something he has no idea about." She waited. "Frank Calloway," I said. "Frank Calloway. Signed, affidavit. 19 pages of documented pattern. Third-party corroboration meeting Ohio's preponderance standard for inclination and opportunity. His attorney has built an entire strategy on the assumption that you're working alone, that your evidence is limited to what you personally observe, that he controls the timeline." I drove home in the dark. November in Columbus, dark by 5:30, the highway overpasses lit yellow-orange. I parked in the driveway and sat with the engine running before I went in. The kitchen light showed through the side window. I thought about all the times I'd pulled into this driveway, and that light was just the light, not evidence of anything, just home. Joel was in the kitchen. He'd made soup from a can, I could tell from the saucepan, the quiet apology of a Thursday night when nobody planned dinner. He was at the counter with his phone, and he looked up when I came in, and there was the face, the careful version, the one he'd worn since Tuesday night. Something recalibrating. We ate in the kind of quiet that can be mistaken for peace for years at a time if you're not paying attention to the texture of it. The microwave clock read 2:07 when I stopped pretending I was going to sleep. I went down the hall to the living room and sat on the couch in the dark. The only light was the microwave clock. No phone, no lamp. The cat settled in against my leg and the house pressed back with all its accumulated quiet. 2:07. I'd been lying in that bed for 90 minutes. The first wave came sometime around 2:15. Not dramatic, just arithmetic. 17 years of Sunday chicken and French press coffee and approved calendar entries, and the one Tuesday I asked about a receipt and then apologized for asking. Apologized. To a man who was at that point building his exit, to a man who would later keep his dead father alive in the cash withdrawal explanation because it was easier than answering the actual question, I traded my own perception for his. I did that. Not once. Not in a moment of weakness. I did it every time he offered a reframe, and I took it because his certainty felt better than my doubt, because his patient disappointment when I questioned things functioned as information about my own reliability. I borrowed his certainty the way you borrow money quietly, at rates you don't examine until the bill comes, and the number is larger than you thought you owed. 3 a.m. The cat asleep, breathing slow, and even against my leg. The draft narrative Karen had described. Patterns of emotional unavailability, anxiety affecting the marital relationship. He hadn't assembled those emails in the last 3 weeks. He'd been collecting them. The same way I file documentation at work, patient systematic building, toward a conclusion he'd already drawn. He prepared to leave correctly. Not just leaving with the right story in place with me, cast as the difficult one, the unstable one, the woman who made a reasonable man finally make a hard decision. He was writing that chapter of my life, and he was going to hand me a copy without having asked me to contribute so much as a word to the text. The cat shifted. I put my hand on his back. Frank at the Holiday Inn on Morse Road. A man who found a crack in a load-bearing wall, and instead of convincing himself it was superficial, got out a small notebook and started writing things down. He didn't confront. He didn't act on incomplete data. He built a record and waited for the moment when it was complete enough to be useful. He didn't catch Renee. He built a record. I had been trying to catch Joel since Tuesday night, moving in his frame, following his rules, reacting to what he chose to show me. Catching requires him to let something slip. Catching means I find what he's already decided I can find on his schedule at the moment of his choosing. I am a bank manager. I have spent 20 years sitting across from people who want me to accept their version of the numbers, and I have learned to look at the actual account history, the actual pattern, the actual story the data tells when nobody is managing the Cowton. Presentation. I know how to build a case for suspected fraud. I know what it takes to make a picture irrefutable before the account holder knows the audit has started. I had the voice note photograph. I had $31,400 in documented cash withdrawals with a 3-page correlation analysis. I had a Sunday night recording of a man explaining those withdrawals by citing a father he buried in February of 2022. I had a structural engineer in a Holiday Inn on Morse Road who had spent 4 months building 19 pages of corroboration without knowing that's what he was building. I had everything except the decision to use it. The light at the window changed. The first gray-blue of Ohio winter dawn arriving before sunrise without announcing itself. The microwave clock read 5:58. I picked up my phone. I found Frank's name. I had been waiting for permission to know what I already knew. 2 years at least, probably longer, a version of waiting that dressed itself up as trust and ate Sunday dinner with me and asked how my week was. I was done waiting. I called Frank. He picked up on the second ring. I need to ask you something directly, I said. If Karen files a fault divorce on adultery grounds, we need inclination and opportunity documented from a third party. That's you. Affidavit. Possibly testimony at the hearing. Are you willing? A pause. Not hesitation. The pause of a man who had been waiting for a specific question and wanted to answer it correctly. I've been waiting for you to ask, Frank said. It means everything comes out. It already came out, Tess. We're just deciding what to do with the wreckage. At 9 that morning, I sat in Karen's waiting room while the filing processed. I had my coat on and my hands in my lap, and I looked at the framed Ohio landscapes on the wall without really seeing them. The first time I'd lied to myself about his collar, I was afraid of the answer. I was still afraid that hadn't changed, and I wasn't pretending it had. But I was afraid holding evidence now, which was a different thing entirely. Different enough to matter. Karen came out at 9:40. It's filed, she said. Fault grounds. Adultery. Joel's attorney's draft filing is still sitting on their end. She paused just long enough. He missed his window. I drove to work. I sat through 2 meetings and answered my email and approved a commercial loan for a restaurant on Parsons Avenue that had the numbers and deserved the chance. At 4:30, I texted Frank from the parking lot, filed this morning. Thank you. His response took 6 minutes. Let me know what you need. 3 weeks later, I sat at the plaintiff's table in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas Family Division, and I kept my hands folded, and I did not look at the door. I heard it when Joel came in, not his footsteps. I knew the rhythm of those, but the small shift in the quality of the room that happens when the person you've spent 17 years with enters a space you're both in. He sat across the room with his attorney, a careful-looking man named Whitmore, who had the expression of someone managing expectations. Joel looked at me. I turned my head and met it. The look I knew, patient, faintly sorrowful, the one that used to mean we really have to do it this way. I held it. I didn't look away first. He did. Whitmore went first. The estrangement, he called it. The difficulties. His client's desire for a fair and equitable process. He used the word reasonable 4 times in 6 minutes, which told me something about the narrative Joel had given him to work with. Then Karen presented Frank's affidavit. 19 pages. A licensed structural engineer with no criminal history and no financial relationship to either party, who had documented his observations over 4 months, dates, times, addresses, time-stamped photographs. Joel's car at 4412 Birchwood Drive on Wednesday evenings and Thursday afternoons, consistent with calendar entries marked client dinner in the shared account. The photographed text exchange. Joel's number? Joel's words. 9 months ago to the woman he had been married to before me. I miss this. I miss you. I think about it constantly. The dissipation summary. $31,400 in cash ATM withdrawals over 14 months. Pattern analysis formatted like a bank fraud referral because that is functionally what it was. Then the kitchen recording. Joel's voice unhurried a Sunday evening he'd been getting cash for his dad's prescriptions. His dad didn't like the pharmacy delivery, didn't want to mix it with the household account. Joel's father, who died in February of 2022. Whitmore asked for a recess. In the hallway, Joel found me before Karen could. His attorney was far enough away to be technically present and practically absent. Joel stood in front of me in the fluorescent hallway light, and he looked like a man who had just been handed a structural report on a building he'd trusted his whole life. Frank Calloway, he said. Yes, I didn't think you would, I know. He said my name. He had a version of this. Ready, I could see it. The careful explanation, the reframe, the patient recasting of what had just happened in that courtroom into something more manageable. He'd been doing it for years, and for years it had worked, and the habit of it was still in his face even now. You prepared an exit, I said. I'm glad I prepared one too. The judge awarded a temporary freeze on all joint assets, including the $22,000 subject to reversal pending discovery. Temporary spousal support to me. Fault grounds accepted for proceeding to contested divorce. Whitmore filed a response, indicating they would contest. Karen leaned toward me at the table and said quietly, He'll settle. Give it 6 weeks. She was off by 2. It took 8. The settlement offer arrived on a Thursday in October. The oaks on Broad Street had gone brown-orange, and the light was coming in sideways, the way it does in Columbus in the fall. That particular Midwestern October light that makes everything look like it's being preserved in something. I read the offer 4 times at my kitchen table. And then I drove to a coffee shop in Short North that I'd been meaning to try for a year and never had, because it was in a neighborhood Joel didn't go to, and I was building a habit of choosing things for no reason except that I wanted to. The settlement was not everything I lost. It was everything that was mine. The equity split in my favor under the fault ruling. The dissipation credit $31,400 returned to the marital estate and applied to my share. Joel's request for spousal support denied he earned more than I did, had always earned more than I did, and the court found no basis for the request given the documented circumstances of the marriage's dissolution. The house, the vegetable garden I never have time for, The cat. It wasn't restoration. There was no version of this where 17 years of misplaced trust became something other than what it was. But the numbers reflected the truth now. The account matched the record. That was what I had asked for, and that was what I had. I was going to sign it tomorrow. I was sitting there with my second coffee when the door opened behind me, and I heard someone order a black coffee at the counter, and I turned the way you turn when something in a room changes, and it was Frank Calloway. Tall glasses, a winter coat I hadn't seen before. He turned from the counter with his cup and saw me. Columbus is not a small city. Short North is a specific neighborhood. We had both separately been avoiding the places we used to go, and we had both separately ended up here. He raised his cup. I raised mine. He took a table near the window, not with me, just in the same room, and I turned back to the settlement offer on the table in front of me, and the October light coming through the glass, and the second coffee I had ordered because I had time. I had time. I was going to sign tomorrow and mean it. Not because it was everything, but because it was true. That was enough. For the first time in longer than I could accurately account for, it was enough. I want to tell you something before you go. Not about the settlement, not about the hearing or the affidavit or the recording I made on a Sunday evening with my phone in my cardigan pocket. You've heard all of that. I want to tell you about 2 years ago, a Tuesday, a coat collar that smelled like something I didn't buy, I asked. Gently, the way you ask when you already know the answer might break something, so you make your voice small to soften the landing. He looked at me with such patient disappointment, as though I had accused him of something beneath both of us. And I apologized. If you recognized something in this story, not the legal parts, not the Ohio law, not the coffee shops, but that part, the apology part, the part where you asked a reasonable question and somehow ended up being the one who was sorry, I need you to know something. That apology is not a character flaw. It is not proof that you were wrong or paranoid or difficult. It is what happens when someone has spent enough time making you distrust your own perception that apologizing feels safer than being right. You were not crazy. You were managed. The dot on the screen was real. The receipt was real. The cologne you didn't buy was real. The Tuesday nights that didn't add up were real. You knew. You have probably known for longer than you've let yourself admit. Knowing counts. I spent 17 years thinking it didn't. It does. I don't know your story, but if you have a parking lot moment, a calendar entry that didn't match a question you apologized for asking, I want to hear it. Not because I have answers, because the woman sitting in her car at 8:47 on a Tuesday night deserves to know she is not sitting there alone. Here is what Tess learned, and what I want you to carry with you. When someone spends enough time reframing your reality, explaining away what you saw, correcting how you felt, meeting your doubt with patient disappointment until apologizing felt easier than being right. You don't lose your instincts all at once. You loan them out a little at a time at rates you stop examining. One Tuesday you ask about a receipt and end up sorry for asking. One Wednesday you smell something wrong and decide you must be imagining it. And slowly, without any single moment, you can point to you stop filing reports on the things you notice. You mark everything inconclusive. You trust the building because it's always been standing. The first lesson Tess learned is the one that costs the most to learn late. Your perception is not the problem. The crack in the wall is real, whether or not someone keeps explaining that it's just the light. If you have been apologizing for seeing things clearly, that apology is not evidence of your instability. It is evidence that someone worked very hard to make you doubt yourself and that they were good at it. The second thing is harder. Tess didn't win because she was smarter than Joel. She won because she stopped reacting inside his frame and started building her own record. She stopped trying to catch him, which would have kept her in the position of waiting for him to slip, and started doing what she actually knew how to do. She audited the account. She documented the pattern. She let the data tell the story instead of asking him to confirm it. You already know how to do this. Whatever your version of the bank statements is, the texts you screenshotted, the dates you wrote down, the conversations you remember more clearly than anyone wants you to, that is your record. It counts. Evidence you gathered quietly alone because something in you refused to mark it inconclusive is still evidence. The third thing is the one Tess almost missed. She did not do this alone. Frank Calloway was not a coincidence. He was a man who had been building his own record for 4 months before she ever sent that text, and when their records met, they were stronger than either one was separately. If you are in a situation where the truth is yours, but the audience has been managed against you, the most powerful thing you can do is find the other person who has also been watching. They exist. They are usually quieter than you expect and more prepared than you know. And the last thing, the one I want you to sit with, is this: filing first matters. Not just in family court in Columbus, Ohio. In every version of this, the person who defines what happened gets to shape what comes next. For years, Tess let Joel be the one who defined things. The moment she filed her own version with documentation, with corroboration, with her name at the top, the story became hers to tell. You are allowed to tell yours. If any part of this felt familiar, the Tuesday night in the parking lot, the apology for asking the receipts that didn't add up, or just the quiet of a house where something has been wrong for longer than you've said out loud, I want to ask you something. What did you know before you let yourself be convinced you didn't know it? You don't have to answer here, but I hope you answer it somewhere.